Hi, my name is Kamden Strunk. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm an associate professor of educational research at Auburn University, where I also coordinate our educational psychology program, and I'm also the 2020 to 2021 chair of the Queer Studies SIG. I'm responding today to a question from the graduate student committee, and I'll read the question and then sort of maybe offer my thoughts about it. So the question was, what advice would you give to graduate students in queer and trans studies who will be on the academic and higher education job market in the next 1 to 2 years, particularly given university austerity measures that may privilege dominant forms of research and scholarship or result in hiring freezes? So ordinarily, what I would say about job market advice is that it's all terrible. That advice is almost always being given by people who aren't having to try to enact that, right? So I think about I've been in my current position, this is my 6th year here. Um, and so that's really the last time I went sort of hard on the job market was the year I sought this position. Um, so a lot changes every year. The conditions seem to get worse in the job market every year. So I have my personal perspective as somebody who's been on quite a few search committees, um, but the norms and conditions are so different institution to institution that you really have to take any job market advice with a grain of salt, I think, because it's just so idiosyncratic. So many of these processes are not logical or rational in any way, and so what I've seen work here and at other institutions where I've been doesn't necessarily mean that that would be useful other places. Um, and the context of the question here asks about particularly the next 1 to 2 years, given the pandemic and the ways that universities are using that as an opportunity to introduce austerity measures, um, means that there will be fewer job openings in the next year or two, I think. I would suspect, especially this year, that we'll see fewer job ads total. I know some institutions have hiring freezes, others are actually doing cuts, not just hiring freezes, and then some institutions are still hiring. So it varies, I think, based on a number of factors, but there are a lot of institutions taking this as an opportunity to cut back. Um, my sense from being involved in faculty searches from the sort of hiring side um, is this piece about maybe if we have fewer openings, we'll be less likely to give those to folks doing queer and trans studies. That may be true in some locations, and I suspect it has a lot to do with how they structure their jobs. Um, I know that the positions I've been involved in doing in the searches for. Those were really faculty driven processes. And so the faculty were largely making decisions about what was in the job call, what criteria they were looking for, which candidates they were interviewing, and really other considerations like upper administration considerations weren't usually coming into play until pretty late in the process. Um, that said, I think if we have fewer job openings, it's more likely that those might be listed in sort of the core areas of a given discipline. And so I think like in ed psych, you think about motivation, emotion, cognition, that those will probably be the areas that people will be searching in more so than trying to change the field. Um, that said, I don't know how different my job market advice will be in this climate. Um, it's if you're looking for an academic job, it's one of those things where I'm sure you've heard before. It's important to be sort of willing to search broadly, and being place bound makes it a little more difficult because there's fewer institutions to look for ads from. Um, and I often hear people give the advice for sort of applying for anything that moves. I think that that's um, not great advice because you don't want to spend your time and energy applying for something where clearly the minimum qualifications of that job are not aligned with what you can do. But if there's you can meet the minimum qualifications and can make some arguments about the preferred or desired qualifications that I think it's worth applying. Um, One of the things that I notice applicants often not doing is in their cover letter being really clear about how they meet the minimum and preferred qualifications. An example is that our job ads often say we want people who can teach online, and then you often see cover letters that never mention the ability to teach online. Now, most of our classes are face to face, but we do have that as a minimum qualification because there's at least some online stuff going on. And often people just don't mention it in their cover letter. I think sometimes it's like an assumption that we'll look at the vita and realize that you've taught online before. Um, and my experience is many people won't look that deeply. They'll read the cover letter, try to check off the boxes on the rubric that we might use if the institution uses a rubric. We do here. But just to make sure that whatever is listed as a qualification, you've actually explicitly made a point of saying that. Now, not saying qualification number 3, here's how I meet it, but if they said, for example, ability to teach online, somewhere in there have a sentence that says, I can teach online, here's my experience teaching online. Yeah, and so I think the other thing that's likely to be weird in job searching for the next year is I think campus visits won't be happening. Um, that in some ways levels the playing field a little bit because the process of having to pay for travel and get reimbursed later is just brutal, especially as a graduate student or early career professional. Um, so I suspect there'll be a lot more Zoom interviews going on. I think our institution will do Zoom interviews for most of this year. Um, Also because I think we're noticing it to the question about austerity, we're noticing it saves money to not do those visits. But what becomes important then, I think, is finding other ways to figure out how you feel about the institution and the place, because you're not going to get a chance to tour and talk with lots of folks and just sort of informally experience the culture. So thinking about how you're going to get that information when those Zoom interviews are not providing a lot of informal interaction opportunities. Um, so I don't know how much specific advice I have about the next 1 to 2 years given the austerity measures. What I want to say though is, and this is easy advice to give from a position of having a tenured job, but I think it's very tempting to try to sell your work in a way that you think people will want to buy. And so what I mean is it's tempting to downplay the queerness of your work. It's tempting to downplay how radical your work is. And I would say be careful about that because um, if you're offered a job based on sort of pretending that your work isn't so queer, isn't so radical, then you're left with a decision about what to do if you get that job. Are you then going to not do the work, or are you going to sort of pull a bait and switch there, which is going to cause some um, potentially hard feelings? Do you want to work at an institution where if you told them about the work you do, they wouldn't hire you? So I think just being really strategic, but also authentic in those materials feels really important to me. And you know, and from there, it's back to the fact that it's an irrational process. When you get rejected, it's likely not just about you. I mean, the advice I give my own students is if you're sending out a lot of letters and getting no first round interviews, ask folks to look at your letters and see how you might be able to improve or strengthen the letters you're sending. Because if you figure they're on average going to be first round interviewing 5 to 10 people, then maybe in the average application is going to get 50 to 100 applicants. You know, maybe every 5 or 10 that you send out, you might be expecting to get a Zoom interview. And so if you're not getting any Zoom interviews or first round interviews, then the materials are where to look. If you're getting first round interviews but no campus interviews, then try to see if you can find folks to do a practice first round interview with you and give you some advice on how you're showing up in those. So it's also about noticing where in the process is it that you tend to not get to that next step and thinking about what are ways you might be able to improve it, while also recognizing that it is going to be a really tight job market. And unfortunately, I don't know that I have advice for how to sort of circumvent that. But given the question is about the privileging of dominant forms of research and scholarship in austerity, I hope that won't become the dominant norm, that won't become the norm to just sort of scale back on our efforts to do critical work in the academy. But I also think it'll be important to be authentic so that if you do get that job, you'll be willing to be in that institution and know that they value the work that you do.